Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of the construction site, her worn work boots planted firmly in the dusty ground as she surveyed the chaos before her. The morning sun cast long shadows across the half-built warehouse, where dozens of workers moved like ants around steel beams and concrete foundations. At 28, she had already spent 3 years trying to rebuild her life after leaving the military, but some days the transition felt harder than any mission she had ever completed. The foreman's whistle pierced the air, signaling the start of another grueling day. Sarah adjusted her hard hat and picked up her tool belt, the familiar weight bringing a strange comfort. Physical labor had become her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in the rhythm of honest work and forget, even temporarily, about the memories that haunted her sleep. "Hey, Martinez," called out Jake, a burly man in his 40s who had been working construction for over 20 years. His voice carried the authority of someone used to being heard over machinery and wind. "You're on foundation prep today. Think you can handle mixing concrete without breaking a nail?" The comment drew snickers from several nearby workers, but Sarah simply nodded and headed toward the cement mixer. She had learned early in her construction career that responding to such remarks only invited more attention, and attention was something she preferred to avoid. Her strategy was simple: work harder than anyone else, say less than anyone else, and eventually they would respect her skills if not her presence. As she began measuring cement and gravel, Sarah's mind wandered to the conversation she had had with her therapist the previous week. Dr. Reeves had been pushing her to be more open about her military background, arguing that hiding such a significant part of herself was preventing genuine connections with her. "You served your country with honor," Dr. Reeves had said, her gentle voice filling the small office. "That's something to be proud of, not something to hide." But pride was complicated when you were a woman in a male-dominated field, when every day brought subtle challenges to your competence and belonging. Sarah had learned that revealing her military service often led to more questions than respect, more skepticism than admiration. People expected veterans to look a certain way, and a 5'6" woman with calloused hands and quiet demeanor didn't fit their mental image. The concrete mixer roared to life, drowning out the chatter around her. Sarah found peace in the mechanical symphony of construction work, the grinding of gears, the hiss of hydraulics, the steady thump of hammers against wood. These sounds were honest and predictable, unlike the complex social dynamics that swirled around every job site. During her lunch break, Sarah sat alone on a stack of lumber, unwrapping the sandwich she had made that morning. Turkey and mustard on wheat bread, the same meal she had eaten for the past 6 months. Routine provided stability, and stability was something she craved after years of unpredictable deployments and dangerous missions. "Mind if I sit?" asked a voice behind her. Sarah turned to see Maria, one of the few other women on the crew. Maria worked in the office, handling paperwork and coordinating with suppliers, but she often came out to the construction site during breaks to escape the confines of her small workspace. "Sure," Sarah replied, scooting over to make room. Maria settled beside her with a heavy sigh. "Sometimes I wonder what I'm doing here," she said, gesturing toward the construction site. "My mother thinks I'm crazy for not pursuing a nice office job in the city." "Why don't you?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. Maria was intelligent and articulate, with a degree in business administration that certainly qualified her for more prestigious positions. "Because this feels real," Maria replied after a moment of consideration. "We're building something that will last, creating jobs, contributing to the community. There's meaning in that, you know." Sarah nodded, understanding completely. After years of missions that felt disconnected from civilian life, construction work provided a tangible sense of accomplishment. Every wall raised and every foundation poured was visible progress, proof that her efforts mattered. "What about you?" Maria continued. "What brought you to construction? You don't strike me as someone who always dreamed of operating heavy machinery." The question hung in the air like dust motes in sunlight. Sarah considered her response carefully, weighing honesty against privacy, connection against self-protection. "I needed work that challenged me physically," she said finally. "Sitting behind a desk all day would drive me insane." It was true, though incomplete. Sarah had tried office work immediately after leaving the military, spending 8 miserable months as a security consultant for a corporate firm. The fluorescent lights, endless meetings, and political maneuvering had felt like a different kind of prison. Construction work might be physically demanding and sometimes thankless, but it was honest labor that left her exhausted enough to sleep without nightmares. "I respect that," Maria said. "Though I have to ask, don't the guys give you a hard time? I know Jake and his crew can be pretty rough around the edges." Sarah shrugged, finishing her sandwich before responding. "They test everyone at first. It's nothing personal." But even as she said the words, Sarah knew they weren't entirely true. The testing seemed more intense for her, more persistent, more designed to prove she didn't belong. She had endured comments about her strength, her competence, her presence on what many workers considered a man's job site. Some days the challenges felt familiar, reminiscent of her early days in military training when she had to prove herself worthy of respect and inclusion. The afternoon brought a new project, moving steel beams from the delivery truck to their designated positions throughout the construction site. It was work that required coordination, strength, and careful attention to safety protocols. Sarah worked alongside Tommy, a recent college graduate who had joined the crew just 2 weeks earlier. "These things are heavier than they look," Tommy gasped as they maneuvered a particularly long beam around a concrete pillar. "The key is using your legs, not your back," Sarah replied, adjusting her grip to demonstrate proper lifting technique. "And never rush. Speed gets people hurt." Tommy nodded gratefully, clearly struggling with the physical demands of the job. Sarah found herself naturally falling into a mentoring role, offering guidance and encouragement without making him feel inadequate. It was behavior that came from years of military experience, where looking out for team members was both duty and survival strategy. As the workday progressed, Sarah noticed Jake watching her interactions with Tommy with something resembling approval. Perhaps her willingness to help the crew member had earned her a small measure of respect, or maybe he appreciated having someone else willing to train inexperienced workers. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when the incident occurred that would change everything. Sarah was operating a small crane, carefully positioning steel beams according to the architectural plans, when she heard shouting from across the construction site. "Fire, fire in the trailer." Black smoke was billowing from the temporary office where Maria worked, and Sarah could see flames through the windows. Without thinking, she shut down the crane and ran toward the burning structure, her mind automatically switching into crisis mode. The trailer served as both office space and storage for important construction documents, but more critically, Sarah knew that Maria had been working inside just 20 minutes earlier. Other workers were gathering around the fire, some calling 911, others attempting to use fire extinguishers on the flames that were spreading with alarming speed. "Where's Maria?" Sarah shouted over the noise of crackling flames and shouting voices. "She went to get coffee," someone replied. "I think she's still inside." Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher and headed for the trailer door. The heat was intense, and smoke was making visibility nearly impossible, but her training kicked in with crystal clarity. She had been in burning buildings before, had navigated hostile environments where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. "Martinez, don't," Jake called out. "The fire department is on the way." But Sarah was already moving, her body operating on instincts honed through years of dangerous missions. She pulled her work shirt up over her nose and mouth, creating a makeshift filter against the smoke, and pushed through the trailer door. Inside, the heat was overwhelming and the smoke burned her eyes and throat. Sarah dropped to her hands and knees, staying low where the air was clearer, and began systematically searching the small space. The trailer was divided into 3 sections: a main office area, a small break room, and a storage closet. She could hear the flames spreading overhead, consuming the ceiling tiles and electrical fixtures with hungry intensity. "Maria," she called out, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "Maria, where are you?" A weak cough came from the direction of the storage closet, barely audible over the roar of flames. Sarah crawled toward the sound, feeling her way along the wall as visibility dropped to nearly zero. The heat was becoming unbearable, and she knew they had very little time before the entire structure would be compromised. She found Maria unconscious on the floor of the storage closet, having apparently been overcome by smoke while trying to retrieve something from the filing cabinets. Sarah quickly checked for a pulse, weak but steady, and began the process of getting them both out of the burning building. Moving an unconscious person through a smoke-filled environment required strength, technique, and absolute focus. Sarah positioned Maria in a fireman's carry, distributing her weight properly to maintain balance and mobility. Every step was calculated, every breath measured, as she navigated back through the burning trailer toward the exit. The door frame was engulfed in flames, and Sarah could hear the structure beginning to groan under the stress of the fire. She paused for a moment, gathering her strength, then sprinted through the burning doorway with Maria's unconscious form draped across her shoulders. They tumbled to the ground just as the trailer's roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and debris. Sarah rolled away from the flames, still protecting Maria's body with her own, as her rushed forward to help. "Someone call an ambulance," Sarah gasped, checking Maria's breathing and pulse while other workers formed a protective circle around them. "She's taken in a lot of smoke." Within minutes, the construction site was swarming with emergency personnel. Paramedics took over Maria's care while firefighters worked to contain the blaze that had completely consumed the temporary office. Sarah found herself sitting in the back of an ambulance, receiving oxygen treatment for smoke inhalation, while a paramedic checked her for burns and other injuries. "You're lucky," the paramedic said, examining her hands and arms. "Minor burns, nothing serious, but you should get checked out at the hospital." "I'm fine," Sarah replied, though her voice was still rough from the smoke. "How's Maria?" "She's stable, smoke inhalation, but she'll recover. You probably saved her life." As the emergency vehicles began to disperse, and the construction crew started the process of securing the site, Sarah found herself the center of attention in a way she had never wanted or expected. Workers who had barely acknowledged her presence were now approaching with expressions of amazement and respect. "That was incredible, Martinez," said Tommy, his eyes wide with admiration. "I can't believe you just ran into that fire like it was nothing." "Where did you learn to do that?" asked another worker. "That was like something out of an action movie." Sarah deflected their questions with modest responses, insisting that anyone would have done the same thing, that she had simply acted on instinct. But she could see the shift in how they looked at her. The way their attitudes toward her had fundamentally changed in the space of a few dramatic minutes. Jake approached as she was preparing to leave the construction site, his expression serious and thoughtful. "Martinez," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" Sarah asked, though she suspected where the conversation was heading. "For underestimating you, for treating you like—" He paused, struggling with his words. "Like you didn't belong here. What you did today, that took real courage, real skill." Sarah nodded acknowledgement, but didn't respond immediately. She had learned that accepting praise gracefully was often more difficult than enduring criticism, and she wasn't sure how to process this sudden shift in perception. "Jake," she said finally, "I appreciate that, but I hope you'll judge me by my work, not by one dramatic moment." "Fair enough," he replied, "but I have a feeling there's more to your story than you've been letting on." As Sarah drove home that evening, her truck windows down to let fresh air clear the lingering smell of smoke from her hair and clothes, she reflected on the day's events. The fire had been unexpected, dangerous, and had required her to draw upon skills and instincts she had hoped to leave behind. But perhaps Dr. Reeves had been right about the value of letting people see who she really was. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Maria, who had been released from the hospital after several hours of observation. "Thank you for saving my life. We need to talk when I get back to work." Sarah smiled for the first time in weeks. Maybe it was time to stop hiding from her past and start figuring out how to integrate it with her future. The construction site would never look at her the same way again, and perhaps that wasn't such a bad thing after all. The rescue had been automatic, instinctive, drawing upon training that had been drilled into her consciousness through years of military service. But as she pulled into her driveway and sat in the silence of her truck, Sarah began to understand that hiding her capabilities wasn't protecting her. It was limiting her potential to contribute meaningfully to the community she was trying to build. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself through consistent work rather than dramatic heroics. But tonight, for the first time since leaving the military, Sarah Martinez felt like she might finally be finding her place in the civilian world. The construction site buzzed with unusual energy the following Monday morning. Word of Sarah's heroic rescue had spread beyond the immediate crew, reaching the company's main office and even local news outlets. A reporter from the county newspaper had called the site's supervisor asking for an interview, but Sarah had politely declined, preferring to let the incident fade into workplace legend rather than public attention. Maria returned to work 3 days after the fire, her voice still slightly hoarse but her spirits remarkably high. The temporary office trailer had been a complete loss, forcing the administrative operations into a borrowed mobile unit that felt cramped and inadequate. Despite the inconvenience, Maria seemed energized by the experience, approaching her work with renewed enthusiasm that surprised her. "It's funny," Maria confided to Sarah during their lunch break. "Almost dying made me realize how much I actually love my job. Even the boring parts feel meaningful now." Sarah understood the sentiment completely. Near-death experiences had a way of clarifying priorities, of stripping away the trivial concerns that normally occupied mental space. She had experienced that clarity many times during her military service, though she had never discussed those experiences with anyone in her civilian life. "I've been thinking about what you did," Maria continued, picking at her salad thoughtfully. "The way you moved through that smoke, the way you knew exactly what to do, that wasn't luck or adrenaline, that was training." The observation hung between them like a challenge. Sarah had been expecting this conversation, knowing that her actions during the fire had revealed capabilities that couldn't be easily explained by construction work experience alone. "Everyone has different backgrounds," Sarah replied carefully. "Different skills they bring to the job." "Military background," Maria said, making it a statement rather than a question. "My brother served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He talks about the training they gave him for combat situations. What you did in that trailer, that was military-level crisis response." Sarah set down her sandwich, recognizing that the moment she had been dreading and anticipating had finally arrived. She could continue deflecting, maintaining the careful distance she had cultivated, or she could take the risk of opening up to someone who might actually understand. "Navy," she said quietly, 8 years active duty." "What did you do in the Navy?" Maria asked, her voice gentle but persistent. Sarah hesitated for a long moment, weighing honesty against habit. "Special operations, maritime security, hostage rescue, anti-terrorism." The words felt strange, leaving her lips after years of careful omission. Sarah had become so accustomed to describing her military service in vague terms, if she mentioned it at all, that speaking specifically about her role felt almost like revealing classified information. Maria's eyes widened with understanding. "SEAL teams." "Women weren't officially allowed in SEAL teams until after I got out," Sarah replied, which was technically true while avoiding the complexity of her actual classification. "But the Navy had special programs, cross-training opportunities." It was the closest she had ever come to acknowledging the reality of her military experience to a civilian colleague. Sarah had been part of an experimental integration program that embedded female special operations personnel with traditionally male units for specific missions. The work had been challenging, dangerous, and ultimately classified at levels that made casual conversation impossible. "So when you ran into that fire," Maria said slowly, "you were basically doing what you were trained to do." "Partly," Sarah admitted, "though the stakes were different. In the military, you're prepared for people trying to kill you. Office fires are dangerous, but they're not actively hostile." Maria laughed, a sound that carried both admiration and disbelief. "I can't imagine voluntarily putting myself in situations where people are trying to kill me. What made you choose that kind of work?" The question was one Sarah had been asking herself for years, particularly during the difficult transition to civilian life. The easy answer was patriotism, duty, and service, all of which were true but incomplete. The deeper truth was more complex, involving a combination of personal drive, family expectations, and a desire to prove herself in the most challenging environment possible. "My father was Marine Corps," Sarah said after a thoughtful pause. 3 tours in Vietnam. He never talked much about his service, but he raised me to believe that military service was the highest form of citizenship. When I graduated high school, joining the Navy felt like the natural next step." "And the special operations part?" "That came later. I was working in maritime security, basically protecting Navy vessels from small boat attacks and underwater threats. I was good at it, and my commanding officers recommended me for advanced training. One thing led to another, and eventually I found myself in situations I never could have imagined when I first enlisted." Sarah found herself sharing more than she had intended, drawn forward by Maria's genuine interest and non-judgmental attention. For years, she had carried the weight of her experiences alone, convinced that civilian colleagues couldn't understand or relate to the realities of military service. But Maria's questions felt like genuine curiosity rather than voyeuristic fascination. "Why did you leave?" Maria asked. "8 years is a significant commitment, but it's not a full career. You could have stayed in for 20 years, retired with a pension." The question struck at the heart of Sarah's most difficult memories. She had loved the Navy, loved the challenge and camaraderie of special operations work, loved the sense of purpose that came from protecting American interests around the world. But her military career had ended under circumstances that she still struggled to discuss, even with her therapist. "Medical retirement," Sarah said simply. "Injury during a mission, nothing dramatic, just wear and tear that accumulated over time." It was a carefully constructed truth that avoided the specifics of her last deployment, the mission that had gone wrong in ways that still haunted her sleep. Sarah had been injured, but the physical wounds had healed much faster than the psychological ones. The medical retirement had been as much about mental health as physical limitations, a fact that she found difficult to acknowledge even to herself. "I'm sorry," Maria said, seeming to sense the pain behind Sarah's careful words. "That must have been a difficult transition." "It was," Sarah replied honestly. "Military life provides structure, purpose, clear objectives. Civilian life is messier, more ambiguous. It took me a while to figure out how to navigate it." Their conversation was interrupted by Jake's approach, his expression serious but not unfriendly. "Martinez, I need to talk to you about something." Sarah tensed automatically, wondering if her military background had somehow created problems with her employment. Some employers were uncomfortable with veterans, particularly those with special operations experience, viewing them as potential liabilities or unpredictable elements in workplace dynamics. "Company executives heard about what happened last week," Jake continued. "They want to offer you a promotion, safety coordinator position, better pay, more responsibility, regular hours." The offer was unexpected and generous, exactly the kind of career advancement that Sarah had been hoping for when she started in construction work. But she also recognized the complexity of the situation. The promotion was based on a single dramatic incident rather than sustained performance and competence. "I appreciate the offer," Sarah replied carefully, "but I'd prefer to be evaluated on my regular work performance rather than one emergency situation." Jake nodded approvingly. "I told them you'd say something like that. Shows character. But the truth is, you've been doing excellent work since you started here. The fire rescue just highlighted skills that were already obvious to those paying attention." "What would the safety coordinator job involve?" Maria asked, clearly excited by the possibility of her friend's advancement. "Training new workers, developing safety protocols, investigating accidents, liaising with OSHA inspectors," Jake explained. "It's a supervisory position that requires someone who understands both the practical aspects of construction work and the regulatory environment we operate in." Sarah considered the opportunity carefully. The position would utilize her military training in risk assessment and emergency response, while providing career advancement in the construction industry. It was exactly the kind of role that could bridge her military experience with her civilian goals. "Can I think about it over the weekend?" she asked. "Of course, but don't take too long. Company wants to fill the position before we start the next phase of construction." As Jake walked away, Maria grabbed Sarah's arm with excitement. "This is incredible. It's exactly what you deserve." "Maybe," Sarah replied, though she was already beginning to see the possibilities. "It would certainly be different from what I'm doing now." The rest of the workday passed in a blur of routine tasks and internal reflection. Sarah found herself observing the construction site with new eyes, noting safety hazards and inefficiencies that could be addressed through proper training and protocols. Her military experience had given her a keen eye for operational security and risk management, skills that would translate well to construction safety oversight. During the drive home, Sarah called Dr. Reeves to schedule an emergency appointment. The job offer represented a significant decision point, but more importantly, it was forcing her to confront questions about identity and integration that she had been avoiding for months. "This is the kind of opportunity you've been working toward," Dr. Reeves observed during their session the following evening. "What's holding you back from accepting immediately?" "I'm afraid of expectations," Sarah admitted. If I take this job, I'll have to be more open about my military background. People will expect me to be some kind of super soldier who can handle any crisis. And that frightens you because I'm not invincible. I have limitations, vulnerabilities, bad days, just like everyone else. The military training is useful, but it doesn't make me superhuman. Dr. Reeves leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. It sounds like you're afraid of disappointing people by being human. The observation struck Sarah as uncomfortably accurate. Throughout her military career, she had been held to exceptionally high standards, partly because of her gender and partly because of her role in special operations. The pressure to perform perfectly, to never show weakness or uncertainty, had become deeply ingrained in her personality. Maybe, Sarah said quietly. I've gotten used to exceeding expectations by staying invisible. Taking this promotion would make me very visible. Visibility isn't always a negative thing, Dr. Reeves pointed out. It can also mean recognition, respect, and the opportunity to influence positive change. Sarah nodded, understanding the logic even as she struggled with the emotional implications. She had spent years proving herself through action rather than words, demonstrating competence through consistent performance rather than dramatic gestures. The fire rescue had disrupted that approach, forcing her capabilities into the spotlight in ways that felt both validating and uncomfortable. The weekend provided time for serious reflection. Sarah drove to her favorite hiking trail, a challenging path through state forest that provided both physical exercise and mental clarity. The rhythm of hiking had always helped her process difficult decisions, the combination of physical exertion and natural beauty creating ideal conditions for deep thinking. As she climbed toward the trail's summit, Sarah found herself remembering conversations with her military mentor, Commander Williams. Commander Williams had been the first woman to hold several key positions in naval special operations, and she had taken a personal interest in Sarah's career development. Leadership isn't about being perfect, Commander Williams had said during one of their mentoring sessions. It's about making good decisions under pressure and helping other people achieve their potential. Your job isn't to be invincible, it's to be reliable. The memory brought clarity to Sarah's current dilemma. The safety coordinator position wasn't about demonstrating superhuman abilities. It was about using her experience and training to help create a safer, more efficient workplace. Her military background provided valuable perspective, but it was just one element of her qualifications. By Sunday evening, Sarah had made her decision. She would accept the promotion and embrace the visibility it required. More importantly, she would begin the process of integrating her military experience with her civilian identity, finding ways to honor both aspects of her life story. Monday morning brought a mix of anticipation and nervousness as Sarah prepared to accept the job offer. She arrived at the construction site early, wanting to observe the morning routine from the perspective of someone who would soon be responsible for worker safety and training. The familiar sounds of construction work filled the air, diesel engines warming up, workers calling instructions to each other, the clank of tools being distributed from the equipment trailer. But Sarah now heard these sounds differently, recognizing potential hazards and opportunities for improvement that had been invisible when her focus was simply completing assigned tasks. Jake found her near the main gate, reviewing safety protocols posted on the bulletin board. "Have you made a decision about the promotion?" he asked. "I'll take it," Sarah replied without hesitation. "When would you like me to start?" "Today, if you're ready. We've got new workers starting this week, and training them properly is a priority." Sarah nodded, feeling a familiar surge of purpose that she hadn't experienced since leaving the military. She was about to embark on a new phase of her civilian career, one that would require her to step forward rather than blend into the background. As she walked toward the trailer that would serve as her new office, Sarah reflected on the unexpected path that had brought her to this moment. A construction site fire had revealed capabilities she had been hiding, leading to opportunities she hadn't imagined when she first picked up a tool belt 3 years earlier. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time since leaving the Navy, Sarah Martinez felt like she was moving toward something meaningful rather than simply running away from her past. The integration of her military experience with her civilian goals was finally beginning, and she was ready to see where that journey would lead. The promotion to safety coordinator brought immediate changes to Sarah's daily routine and workplace relationships. Her new office, though small and utilitarian, represented a significant shift from the physical labor that had defined her construction experience. Instead of operating machinery and moving materials, she now spent her days developing training protocols, reviewing safety regulations, and observing work practices with an analytical eye. The transition wasn't entirely smooth. Some workers seemed uncomfortable with her sudden elevation from peer to supervisor, particularly those who had been skeptical of her presence on the construction site from the beginning. Jake had warned her about potential resistance, explaining that rapid promotions sometimes created resentment among workers who felt passed over for advancement. Change takes time, Jake advised during one of their weekly meetings. Focus on doing the job well and eventually people will come around. Sarah's first major challenge came during a routine safety inspection when she discovered several serious violations in the electrical work being performed by Brad, a veteran electrician who had been with the company for over 15 years. The violations weren't malicious, more like shortcuts that had become habitual over time, but they posed genuine risks to worker safety and could have resulted in significant fines if discovered during an OSHA inspection. Martinez, Brad said when Sarah approached him about the violations, his tone carrying barely concealed irritation. I've been doing electrical work since before you even thought about picking up tools. I know what I'm doing. I'm sure you do, Sarah replied diplomatically. But these specific installations don't meet current safety codes, and they need to be corrected before we can pass inspection. Safety codes written by bureaucrats who never done a day of real work, Brad muttered, but he began gathering his tools to make the necessary corrections. The interaction was typical of the resistance Sarah faced during her first month in the supervisory role. Workers who had grudgingly accepted her competence as a laborer were less willing to acknowledge her authority as a safety coordinator. The fact that her promotion had come after the dramatic fire rescue only complicated matters, with some viewing her advancement as based on heroics rather than qualifications. Sarah's response was characteristically methodical. Instead of confronting resistance directly, she focused on demonstrating competence through consistent performance and fair treatment. She spent extra time learning about construction safety regulations, often staying late to research best practices and industry standards. Her military background had taught her that authority must be earned through expertise and reliability, not demanded through position alone. The breakthrough came during a training session for new workers that Sarah had designed to combine theoretical knowledge with practical application. Rather than simply lecturing about safety procedures, she had created hands-on demonstrations that allowed workers to experience the consequences of improper technique in controlled environments. The reason we wear safety harnesses isn't just regulation compliance, Sarah explained to a group of new hires as she demonstrated proper fall protection equipment. It's because a 30-foot fall onto concrete is almost always fatal, and a 15-foot fall can cause permanent disability. She had set up a demonstration using weighted dummies to show the forces involved in construction accidents, allowing workers to see dramatically how proper safety equipment could prevent tragedy. The visual impact was immediate and powerful, creating emotional understanding that complemented intellectual knowledge. Tommy, who had been promoted to crew leader after several months of strong performance, approached Sarah after the training session with obvious enthusiasm. That was incredible, he said. I've been through safety training at 3 different companies, and this was the first time it felt real instead of just checking boxes. Real consequences require real understanding, Sarah replied. People follow safety procedures when they understand why those procedures exist, not just when they're told to follow them. The training session had been observed by several experienced workers, including Brad, who had initially seemed skeptical about Sarah's approach. But as the demonstration progressed, she had noticed his attention becoming more focused, his questions more thoughtful. Where did you learn to teach like that? Brad asked as workers were packing up their equipment. Military training emphasis practical application, Sarah explained. You can't teach someone to operate under pressure just by talking about it. They need to experience controlled stress so they know how to respond when real emergencies occur. Makes sense, Brad admitted grudgingly. I guess there's value in different approaches to training. It was the closest thing to approval that Sarah had received from Brad, and she recognized it as progress in building the credibility necessary for effective safety oversight. The following week brought a situation that would test both Sarah's expertise and her leadership abilities. A severe thunderstorm system was approaching the region, bringing high winds and heavy rain that would make construction work dangerous. Company policy required work stoppage during severe weather, but the project was behind schedule, and pressure was mounting to maintain productivity despite the approaching storm. Sarah found herself in Jake's office early Monday morning, reviewing weather forecasts and discussing the difficult decision about whether to halt construction operations. "The storm isn't supposed to hit until late afternoon," Jake said, pointing to the radar display on his computer screen. "We could get most of a day's work done if we start early and shut down by 2 o'clock. "The wind speeds are already gusting to 30 miles per hour, Sarah replied, checking her own weather data. "OSHA guidelines recommend stopping crane operations when winds exceed 25 miles per hour. We're already past the safe threshold." "Those are guidelines, not absolute rules," Jake pointed out. "And the work we're doing today is critical for staying on schedule." Sarah understood the pressure Jake was facing. Construction projects operated on tight timelines with significant financial penalties for delays. Weather-related work stoppages were a constant source of tension between safety requirements and economic realities. "I understand the schedule pressure," Sarah said carefully, "but crane accidents in high winds are often fatal. Is the schedule worth someone's life?" The question hung in the air between them, representing a fundamental conflict between competing priorities. Sarah had faced similar dilemmas during her military service, where mission objectives sometimes conflicted with safety considerations. But civilian construction work didn't involve the same strategic imperatives that might justify accepting additional risk. "What would you recommend?" Jake asked, clearly struggling with the decision. "Shut down operations now," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Use the day for indoor training, equipment maintenance, and project planning. We can't control the weather, but we can control how we respond to it." Jake considered her recommendation for several long minutes, weighing safety against financial pressure. Finally, he nodded slowly. "You're right, make the announcement. All outdoor work stops immediately." Sarah felt a surge of relief and validation. The decision demonstrated that her safety recommendations carried real weight, that Jake trusted her judgment even when it meant accepting economic consequences. The announcement was met with mixed reactions from the crew. Some workers appreciated the early shutdown, viewing it as an unexpected opportunity to catch up on personal tasks. Others grumbled about lost income and questioned whether the weather conditions were really dangerous enough to justify stopping work. "This is ridiculous," complained one worker as he secured his equipment against the approaching storm. "I've worked in worse weather than this." "Maybe you have," Sarah replied calmly, "but that doesn't mean it was safe. Our job is to complete this project without anyone getting hurt. Everything else is secondary." As the storm moved through the region that afternoon, Sarah's decision was vindicated dramatically. Wind gusts reached 50 miles per hour, strong enough to topple construction equipment and turn loose materials into dangerous projectiles. A nearby construction site that had continued working despite the weather conditions experienced a serious accident when a crane operator lost control in the high winds, resulting in property damage and minor injuries. The following morning, news of the crane accident spread quickly through the construction community, and Sarah found herself receiving congratulations from workers who had initially questioned her caution. "Good call yesterday," Brad said as he prepared his equipment for the day's work. "I heard about what happened over at the Henderson site. Could have been us if we'd kept working." "Safety decisions are easier when you have clear information," Sarah replied. The weather data was unambiguous. "Still takes guts to shut down a job when everyone's pushing to keep going," Brad observed. "Not everyone would have made that call." The successful weather decision marked a turning point in Sarah's relationship with the construction crew. Workers who had been skeptical of her authority began seeking her input on safety-related decisions, and her training sessions started drawing voluntary attendance from experienced workers who wanted to learn new approaches to familiar tasks. Maria had been watching Sarah's transition with obvious pride and satisfaction. During one of their lunch conversations, she shared her observations about how the workplace dynamic had evolved. "You've changed this place," Maria said, gesturing toward the construction site where workers were following safety protocols with obvious care and attention. People are more careful, more thoughtful about how they approach their work. Good safety culture comes from everyone buying into the process, Sarah replied. My job is just to provide information and training. The workers have to choose to apply it. It's more than that, Maria insisted. You've shown them that safety isn't just about following rules. It's about respecting each other enough to work responsibly. The observation resonated with Sarah's understanding of effective leadership from her military experience. The best units weren't those that followed orders blindly, but those where every member understood their role in protecting their teammates. Building that kind of culture required patience, consistency, and genuine commitment to shared values. As autumn progressed, Sarah found herself taking on additional responsibilities beyond basic safety coordination. Jake had begun consulting her on hearing decisions, recognizing that her ability to assess character and potential made her valuable for evaluating job candidates. She had also begun working with the company's main office to develop safety protocols that could be applied across multiple construction sites. Corporate wants to expand your training program to other projects, Jake announced during one of their weekly meetings. They're talking about creating a regional safety coordinator position that would involve traveling between job sites. The opportunity was both exciting and intimidating. It represented significant career advancement and recognition of Sarah's expertise, but it would also require her to work with unfamiliar crews and adapt her approach to different workplace cultures. What would that involve specifically? Sarah asked. Training programs, safety audits, accident investigations, policy development, Jake explained. It's essentially what you're doing here, but on a larger scale with more responsibility. Sarah considered the offer carefully. The regional position would utilize her military experience more fully, particularly her background in training and operational assessment. It would also provide opportunities for professional growth that had seemed impossible when she first started working construction. I'm interested, she said finally. When would this position start? Early next year. They want to finish the current project first, and they want you to help design the training curriculum that would be used company-wide. The conversation continued for another hour, discussing logistics and expectations for the potential promotion. Sarah left Jake's office feeling energized by the possibilities ahead, but also somewhat nostalgic about leaving the close-knit crew that had become her workplace family. That evening, Sarah called Dr. Reeves to discuss the career opportunity and its implications for her continuing civilian transition. This represents exactly the kind of integration we've been working toward, Dr. Reeves observed. You're finding ways to use your military experience productively while building meaningful civilian relationships. It feels good, Sarah admitted. For the first time since leaving the Navy, I feel like I'm contributing something meaningful. What do you think has changed? Dr. Reeves asked. What's different now compared to when you first started construction work? Sarah considered the question thoughtfully. I think I've stopped trying to be someone I'm not. I spent so much energy hiding my military background that I wasn't able to use the skills and experience I actually have. Now I'm finding ways to integrate both parts of my identity. That's significant progress, Dr. Reeves noted. Integration isn't about abandoning your military experience. It's about finding ways to apply that experience productively in civilian contexts. The therapy session continued with discussion about managing the stresses of increased responsibility and maintaining the relationships she had built during her time at the current construction site. Sarah left the appointment feeling confident about her decision to pursue the regional coordinator position, recognizing it as a natural next step in her professional development. The remaining weeks of autumn passed quickly as Sarah prepared for the transition to her new role. She documented her training programs, developed written protocols for ongoing safety coordination, and worked to ensure that her replacement would be able to continue the work she had started. The farewell gathering organized by her was both touching and surprising. Workers who had initially been skeptical of her presence had prepared speeches expressing appreciation for her contributions, and even Brad offered grudging admiration for her approach to safety coordination. You changed my mind about a lot of things, Brad said during the informal ceremony. I've been in this business for 20 years, and I learned more about safety in the past 6 months than in all the previous years combined. As Sarah prepared to leave the construction site that had been her professional home for nearly a year, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this point. A fire rescue had revealed capabilities she had been hiding, leading to opportunities that had seemed impossible when she first picked up a tool belt. The future held new challenges and responsibilities, but Sarah Martinez finally felt like she was building something meaningful rather than simply surviving the transition from military to civilian life. The regional safety coordinator position brought Sarah to construction sites across 3 states, each with distinct workplace cultures and safety challenges. Her new role required extensive travel, sometimes spending weeks away from home while implementing training programs and conducting safety audits. The work was professionally rewarding but personally isolating, leaving her with long hours alone in hotel rooms to confront memories she had successfully avoided for months. The trigger came during a routine inspection at a construction site in Phoenix, Arizona. Sarah was evaluating fall protection procedures when she heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching the work area. The noise was routine. Medical helicopters regularly used nearby hospital landing pads, but something about the specific rhythm and pitch transported her instantly back to her final military deployment. Her hands began trembling as the helicopter passed overhead, and she found herself scanning the horizon for threats that existed only in her memory. The construction workers around her continued their tasks normally, oblivious to her sudden distress, but Sarah felt as though she was drowning in a flood of unwanted recollections. "Ms. Martinez, are you okay?" asked the site supervisor, noticing her apparent distraction. "Fine," Sarah managed, forcing herself to focus on the safety checklist in her hands. "Just thinking through the inspection process." But she wasn't fine, and the helicopter incident marked the beginning of a period where past and present began bleeding together in ways that threatened everything she had built during her civilian transition. Sleep became elusive, filled with dreams that mixed construction site emergencies with military operations gone wrong. During the day, she found herself hypervigilant, automatically assessing threats and escape routes in situations where such awareness was unnecessary. The breaking point came 3 weeks later at a construction site outside Denver. Sarah was conducting a training session on confined space safety when she noticed one of the workers acting strangely, fidgeting, sweating despite cool weather, repeatedly checking his phone for messages. Her military training immediately flagged the behavior as suspicious, potentially threatening, and she found herself preparing for violence that her rational mind knew was unlikely. "Excuse me," she announced to the training group. "We need to take a short break." Sarah approached the agitated worker carefully, her body automatically positioning itself for defensive action, while her conscious mind struggled to maintain professional composure. "Is everything all right?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "My wife's in labor," the worker explained, relief evident in his voice. "The hospital just called. I need to get permission to leave early." The explanation was completely innocent, even joyful, but Sarah's nervous system remained locked in threat assessment mode. She managed to help the worker get permission to leave for the hospital, but the incident left her shaken and questioning her ability to function effectively in civilian environments. That evening, Sarah sat in her Denver hotel room and made 2 difficult phone calls. The first was to Dr. Reeves, scheduling an emergency therapy session for as soon as she could return home. The second was to Jake, requesting a temporary reduction in her travel schedule to address what she described as personal health issues. The conversation with Dr. Reeves took place 3 days later, in the familiar setting of the therapist's office that had become a refuge during Sarah's most difficult periods of civilian adjustment. "It sounds like you're experiencing post-traumatic stress responses," Dr. Reeves observed after Sarah described the recent incidents. "The helicopter trigger and the threat assessment reaction are both consistent with PTSD symptoms." "I thought I had dealt with that," Sarah said, frustrated by what felt like regression after months of progress. "I've been functioning normally for over a year." "PTSD isn't something you deal with once and forget," Dr. Reeves explained gently. "It's a condition that requires ongoing management, especially during periods of stress or change. Your new job involves more travel, more unfamiliar situations, more responsibility. Those factors can reactivate symptoms that have been dormant." Sarah had been dreading this conversation for years, hoping that her military trauma would remain buried beneath the demands of civilian life. She had seen too many veterans struggle with post-traumatic stress, and she had convinced herself that her successful transition meant she was immune to such problems. "What happened during your last deployment?" Dr. Reeves asked quietly. "We've talked around the circumstances of your medical retirement, but you've never described the specific incident that ended your military career." The question opened a door that Sarah had kept locked for nearly 4 years. She had provided brief, clinical descriptions of her injury and retirement, but she had never spoken about the mission that haunted her sleep and triggered her hypervigilance. "Hostage rescue," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "American civilians captured by terrorists in Somalia. We had intelligence indicating where they were being held, and we went in to extract them." The words came slowly, painfully, as Sarah began describing the mission that had changed everything. Dr. Reeves listened without interruption, allowing the story to emerge at its own pace. "The intelligence was wrong," Sarah continued. "What we thought was a simple hostage situation turned out to be a trap. The terrorists knew we were coming, and they had prepared an ambush. By the time we realized what was happening, we were surrounded and taking fire from multiple directions." Sarah's hands clenched involuntarily as she relived the chaos of that night. The confusion of discovering that their mission had been compromised, the desperate fight to extract her team from a kill zone, the horrible realization that the hostages they had come to rescue were already dead. "3 members of my team were wounded in the initial ambush," she said, her voice becoming stronger as she pushed through the most difficult parts of the story. "One of them was Tommy, a kid from Texas who had just turned 22. He took shrapnel in his leg and couldn't move under his own power." Dr. Reeves remained silent, recognizing that Sarah needed to tell the story completely before they could begin processing its emotional impact. "I had a choice," Sarah continued. "Follow protocol and call for extraction, which would have meant leaving Tommy behind temporarily, or break protocol and carry him out myself. I chose to carry him." The decision had been instinctive, based on military training that emphasized never leaving team members behind. But it had also been complicated by the fact that Sarah was one of the smallest members of the team, and carrying a wounded soldier through hostile territory had pushed her physical capabilities beyond their limits. "I made it about halfway to the extraction point before I collapsed," Sarah said. "Torn ligaments in both knees, stress fractures in my back, complete exhaustion. Tommy and I were both recovered by the extraction team, but my injuries ended my military career." "And Tommy?" Dr. Reeves asked gently. "He recovered completely. He's still active duty, probably somewhere in the Middle East right now." Sarah managed a small smile. "He sends me Christmas cards every year." The story hung between them for several minutes while Sarah struggled with emotions she had been suppressing for years. The mission had been both a failure and a success. They had failed to rescue the hostages, but they had all returned home alive despite the ambush. "You saved your teammate's life," Dr. Reeves observed. "I also ended my own career," Sarah replied bitterly. "If I had followed protocol, called for backup, Tommy would have been rescued anyway and I would still be in the Navy." "You made a decision under extreme pressure with incomplete information," Dr. Reeves said. "That's what military personnel are trained to do. The fact that it had personal consequences doesn't make it the wrong decision." The therapy session continued for another hour, with Dr. Reeves helping Sarah begin to process the guilt and trauma she had been carrying since that final deployment. By the end of the session, Sarah felt emotionally drained but somehow lighter, as though sharing the story had reduced its power to control her reactions. Over the following weeks, Sarah worked with Dr. Reeves to develop strategies for managing her PTSD symptoms while maintaining her professional responsibilities. The process involved recognizing triggers, practicing grounding techniques, and gradually exposing herself to stressful situations in controlled environments. The work was difficult and sometimes discouraging, particularly when Sarah experienced setbacks that made her question her ability to function in high-pressure civilian roles. But she was determined to overcome the challenges, recognizing that her current career success depended on finding ways to manage her trauma responses effectively. During this period, Sarah also began attending a veterans support group that met weekly at a community center near her home. She had resisted group therapy for years, preferring the privacy of individual counseling, But Dr. Reeves had convinced her that connecting with other veterans might provide perspective and support that couldn't be found elsewhere. The group included veterans from multiple branches of service and different conflicts, ranging from Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan. What they shared was the common experience of transitioning from military to civilian life, often while dealing with physical and psychological wounds that weren't visible to their new communities. "The hardest part for me," said David, a Marine veteran of 2 Iraq deployments, "was learning to relax. In combat zones, hypervigilance keeps you alive. In civilian life, it makes you seem paranoid and unstable." Sarah nodded in recognition, finding comfort in David's description of challenges she had experienced but never articulated clearly. The group provided a space where military experiences could be discussed without explanation or justification, where the language and concepts of military service were understood automatically. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," added Maria Santos, an Army veteran who had served in Afghanistan. "Civilian life feels too safe, too predictable. Part of me keeps expecting something terrible to happen." The group sessions helped Sarah understand that her struggles were neither unique nor insurmountable. Other veterans had faced similar challenges and found ways to build meaningful civilian lives while managing the ongoing effects of their military experiences. Gradually, Sarah began incorporating the coping strategies she learned in therapy and group sessions into her professional routine. She developed pre-travel rituals that helped her maintain emotional stability while working at unfamiliar construction sites. She practiced mindfulness techniques that allowed her to stay present during stressful situations rather than getting lost in traumatic memories. The progress wasn't linear or easy, but it was measurable. Sarah found herself sleeping better, experiencing fewer intrusive memories, and feeling more confident in her ability to handle unexpected situations without becoming overwhelmed by trauma responses. The real test came 6 months later when Sarah was assigned to conduct a safety audit at a construction site that was behind schedule due to a serious accident. A worker had fallen from scaffolding, resulting in critical injuries and a work stoppage while OSHA conducted its investigation. The situation was exactly the kind of high-stress, high-stakes scenario that had triggered her PTSD symptoms in the past. But this time, Sarah felt prepared. She used her grounding techniques during the flight to the job site, practiced her breathing exercises while reviewing the accident reports, and maintained conscious awareness of her emotional state throughout the inspection process. The audit revealed multiple safety violations that had contributed to the accident, but Sarah was able to address them professionally without becoming overwhelmed by the severity of the situation. She worked with the site supervisor to develop a comprehensive corrective action plan, trained the workers on proper safety procedures, and helped restore confidence in the workplace safety program. "I have to admit," the site supervisor said as Sarah prepared to leave, "I was skeptical about bringing in an outside safety coordinator, but your recommendations are practical and thorough. You clearly know what you're doing." The successful completion of the difficult assignment marked a significant milestone in Sarah's recovery process. She had faced a challenging professional situation without being derailed by trauma responses, demonstrating that her coping strategies were effective even under pressure. That evening, Sarah called Dr. Reeves from her hotel room with an update on her progress. "I feel like myself again," Sarah said, recognizing the significance of the statement even as she spoke it. "Not the person I was before the military, and not the person I became immediately after leaving the Navy, but someone who integrates both experiences into a functional whole." "That's exactly what recovery looks like," Dr. Reeves replied. "It's not about returning to who you were before trauma, it's about becoming who you're capable of being despite the trauma." As Sarah prepared for sleep that night, she reflected on the long journey that had brought her to this point. The path from military service to civilian success had been complicated by trauma that she had tried to ignore rather than address. But confronting those challenges had ultimately made her stronger and more capable than she had been when she was simply surviving from day to day. The future still held uncertainties and challenges, but Sarah Martinez finally felt equipped to face them with confidence rather than fear. Her military experiences would always be part of her story, but they no longer defined the limits of what she could accomplish in civilian life. The crisis that would define Sarah's civilian career began on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning in March. She had been assigned to investigate a serious safety incident at a construction site outside Atlanta, where a crane collapse had injured 2 workers and caused significant property damage. The accident had attracted media attention and regulatory scrutiny that threatened the company's reputation and future contracts. Sarah arrived at the site to find a tense atmosphere complicated by the presence of OSHA investigators, insurance adjusters, and local news crews. The construction workers were clustered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about the accident and speculating about who might be held responsible. The site supervisor, a nervous man named Rick, met her at the gate with obvious relief. "Thank God you're here," Rick said, his voice strained with stress. "This whole situation is a nightmare. The crane went down yesterday afternoon, and now everyone's pointing fingers at everyone else." Sarah nodded sympathetically while privately assessing the challenges ahead. Accident investigations required careful analysis of multiple factors: equipment maintenance, operator training, weather conditions, site management decisions, and the conclusions often determined both legal liability and future safety protocols. "Who was operating the crane when it collapsed?" Sarah asked as they walked toward the accident site. "Mike Torres," Rick replied. "He's been with us for 3 years, good safety record, never had any problems before, but some of the guys are saying he was showing off, trying to lift more than the crane could handle." Sarah made mental notes while observing the debris field created by the crane collapse. The machine had toppled sideways, crushing a temporary building and damaging several pieces of equipment. Emergency responders had already removed the injured workers, but the physical evidence of the accident remained largely undisturbed. As she began her preliminary investigation, Sarah noticed a group of workers watching her with expressions that seemed hostile rather than merely curious. Their body language suggested suspicion and resentment, emotions that often surfaced when outside investigators arrived to examine workplace accidents. "Who's the woman?" she heard one of them ask in a voice loud enough to be clearly audible. "Some safety expert from the main office," another replied dismissively. "Probably never operated heavy machinery in her life." The comments were typical of the skepticism Sarah had learned to expect when working with unfamiliar crews, but something about the tone felt more aggressive than usual. She continued her examination of the accident site while remaining alert to the social dynamics developing around her presence. The situation escalated during the lunch break when Sarah attempted to interview workers who had witnessed the crane collapse. Most were cooperative, providing straightforward accounts of what they had observed, but a small group led by Danny, a longtime crane operator, seemed determined to undermine her investigation. "I don't know why they sent you," Danny said loudly enough for other workers to hear. "This accident happened because of equipment failure, not operator error. Anyone with real experience would know that." "I'm investigating all possibilities," Sarah replied calmly. "Equipment failure is certainly one factor I'm examining." "Yeah, well, maybe you should stick to whatever desk job you came from," Danny shot back. "Leave the real work to people who know what they're doing." The comment drew nervous laughter from some workers, but also seemed to encourage Danny's increasingly aggressive behavior. Sarah recognized the dynamic from her military experience. When groups are under stress, they sometimes turn on outsiders as a way of relieving tension and establishing unity. "I understand this is a difficult time," Sarah said, addressing the group rather than Danny specifically. "A workplace accident affects everyone, and investigations can feel intrusive. But my job is to figure out what happened so we can prevent similar incidents in the future." "Your job," Danny said, stepping closer in a way that felt deliberately intimidating, "is to find someone to blame so the company can avoid liability. We all know how these investigations work." Sarah maintained her composure despite Danny's aggressive posture, drawing on conflict de-escalation techniques learned during military training. She had faced much more dangerous situations than workplace hostility, but the psychological pressure was still significant. "Actually," she replied evenly, "my job is to identify safety failures and recommend improvements. Blame isn't productive, prevention is." The confrontation might have ended there if not for the intervention of Rick, who had been watching the exchange with obvious nervousness. "Martinez," Rick said, his voice carrying an edge of frustration. "Maybe you should focus on the technical aspects of the investigation and leave the worker interviews to people who know the crew." The suggestion was both professionally insulting and practically problematic, implying that Sarah lacked the competence to conduct basic accident investigation procedures. More troubling was the implication that her gender or background made her unsuitable for interacting with construction workers. Worker interviews are a standard part of any safety investigation, Sarah replied, keeping her voice professional despite her growing anger. I need first-hand accounts to understand what happened. Yeah, well, maybe your approach isn't working, Rick said, glancing nervously at Danny and his supporters. These guys are already on edge about the accident. Having an outsider ask a bunch of questions isn't helping. Sarah felt the familiar surge of frustration that came from having her professional competence questioned based on assumptions about her background and capabilities. But before she could respond, the situation took a dramatic turn that would change everything. You want to know what happened? Danny said, his voice rising with apparent anger. I'll tell you what happened. Some pencil pusher in the main office decided to save money by skipping maintenance schedules. That crane hadn't been properly inspected in months, and now they're trying to blame the operator. Do you have documentation to support that claim? Sarah asked, immediately recognizing the potential significance of the allegation. Documentation, Danny laughed bitterly. Lady, the documentation disappeared the same day the crane went down. Amazing how paperwork vanishes when there's an accident. The claim was serious enough to warrant immediate investigation. But before Sarah could ask follow-up questions, Danny's anger seemed to boil over completely. You know what I think, he said, moving closer until he was standing directly in front of her. I think you're just here to rubber stamp whatever story the company wants to tell. You probably don't even know the difference between a hydraulic cylinder and a boom extension. That's enough, Rick intervened, but his tone suggested nervousness rather than authority. No, it's not enough, Danny replied, his voice becoming increasingly aggressive. I'm tired of having outsiders come in and tell us how to do our jobs, especially outsiders who look like they've never done a real day's work in their lives. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest that preceded confrontations, her military training automatically assessing threat levels and preparing defensive responses. But this wasn't a combat situation, and escalation would only undermine her investigation and professional credibility. I understand you're upset about the accident, she said calmly, taking a small step backward to create space. But personal attacks aren't going to help us figure out what went wrong. Personal attacks? Danny laughed harshly. Lady, this isn't personal. This is about competence, about experience, about knowing what you're talking about before you start making accusations. The confrontation was drawing attention from other workers, creating exactly the kind of public spectacle that Sarah preferred to avoid. She could see Rick becoming more agitated by the minute, clearly worried about how the situation was developing. Maybe we should all take a break and cool down, Rick suggested weakly. But Danny seemed determined to push the confrontation to its conclusion. You know what? I bet you've never operated a crane in your life. I bet you've never done any kind of construction work at all. So why don't you just pack up your clipboard and your fancy inspection forms and go back to whatever office building you came from? The insult hit closer to home than Sarah cared to admit. She had worked construction for years, had earned her place through competence and determination, but she still sometimes felt like an outsider in the male-dominated industry. Danny's words were designed to exploit those insecurities, and they succeeded in triggering genuine anger. Actually, Sarah said, her voice taking on an edge that surprised everyone present, I've operated cranes, forklifts, bulldozers, and every other piece of heavy equipment on this site. I've worked construction for 4 years, and before that, I spent 8 years in the Navy doing things that would probably give you nightmares. The revelation seemed to catch Danny off guard, but instead of backing down, he doubled down on his aggressive approach. Navy, he laughed mockingly. What were you, a secretary? A cook? Let me guess, you filed paperwork and pushed pencils for 8 years, and now you think that qualifies you to investigate crane accidents. Sarah felt something snap inside her, a combination of professional frustration and personal anger that overwhelmed her usual restraint. She had spent years proving herself, years earning respect through competence and dedication, and she was tired of having her capabilities questioned by people who knew nothing about her background or qualifications. I was a Navy SEAL, she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that immediately changed the atmosphere around the construction site. I spent 8 years conducting maritime security operations, hostage rescues, and anti-terrorism missions in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. So when I tell you that I know how to investigate an accident, you can take that to the bank. The silence that followed her declaration was complete and profound. Every worker within earshot had stopped what they were doing to stare at the small woman who had just claimed membership in one of the most elite military units in the world. The skepticism on their faces was obvious and immediate. Danny recovered first, his expression shifting from surprise to outright disbelief. "Navy SEALs?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Right, and I'm a Green Beret. Lady, there's no way in hell you were ever a SEAL." "Women weren't officially allowed in SEAL teams until 2016, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil churning inside her. "But the Navy had experimental programs that cross-trained female personnel for special operations missions. I was part of those programs." "Bullshit," Danny said flatly. "Complete and total bullshit. You're making this up to try to intimidate us." Other workers began joining the confrontation, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Sarah realized that her revelation had backfired spectacularly, creating exactly the kind of attention and skepticism she had spent years trying to avoid. "Prove it," said another worker, stepping forward to join Danny's challenge. "If you're really some kind of elite soldier, prove it." Sarah found herself in an impossible situation. She couldn't provide detailed documentation of her military service without revealing classified information, but her claims would be dismissed as fantasy without some kind of verification. The construction site had become a tribunal, with dozens of skeptical workers demanding evidence she couldn't provide. "I don't have to prove anything to you," Sarah said, trying to regain control of the situation. "My job is to investigate this accident, not to satisfy your curiosity about my background." "That's convenient," Danny said with a sneer. "Make wild claims about being some kind of super soldier, then refuse to back them up when challenged." The mockery in his voice was evident to everyone present, and Sarah could see other workers beginning to smile and whisper among themselves. Her attempt to establish credibility had instead made her a target of ridicule. "You want proof," Sarah said, her anger finally overriding her judgment. "Fine, I'll give you proof." What happened next would be remembered by every worker on the construction site for the rest of their careers. Sarah moved with fluid precision that seemed almost inhuman, demonstrating combat techniques that belonged in military training facilities rather than civilian workplaces. First, she picked up a piece of rebar from the ground and bent it into a pretzel shape using leverage and technique rather than brute strength. Then she demonstrated knife-fighting movements using a ruler, moving through combat sequences with speed and precision that left no doubt about her training level. But the most dramatic demonstration came when Tommy Martinez, Danny's closest friend, decided to test Sarah's claims physically. He approached her with obvious intent to grab or restrain her, apparently thinking that he could expose her fake military background through direct confrontation. Sarah's response was instantaneous and overwhelming. She used a combination of joint locks and pressure point manipulation to drop Tommy to his knees in less than 2 seconds, applying just enough force to demonstrate control without causing injury. Tommy found himself completely immobilized, unable to move without risking serious joint damage. "This is how we were trained to subdue hostile subjects without lethal force," Sarah explained calmly, maintaining the hold while addressing the shocked audience. "The technique works regardless of size or strength differential." She released Tommy, who struggled to his feet while flexing his fingers and rotating his shoulders to restore normal sensation. His expression had changed from skepticism to something approaching awe, and he was clearly having difficulty processing what had just happened. "Holy shit," Tommy said quietly, his voice filled with amazement rather than anger. I've never felt anything like that." The demonstration had achieved its intended effect, but Sarah immediately realized that she had made a serious mistake. Using military combat techniques on a civilian construction site crossed numerous professional and legal boundaries, regardless of the provocation that had prompted her actions. "I shouldn't have done that," she said, addressing both Tommy and the larger group of workers. "I apologize for letting the situation get out of hand." But Danny wasn't finished with his challenge. Instead of being impressed or intimidated by Sarah's display of combat skills, he seemed energized by the confrontation. "Okay," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and continued skepticism. "So maybe you do know some martial arts. That doesn't prove you were a Navy SEAL. Lots of people take self-defense classes." Sarah felt the trap closing around her. Every response she made seemed to generate additional challenges, and she was being forced to reveal more about her military background than she had ever intended to share in a civilian workplace. "Look," she said, trying to regain control of the conversation, "my military service isn't relevant to this accident investigation. What matters is figuring out why that crane collapsed and how we can prevent similar incidents." "It's relevant if you're using fake credentials to intimidate workers," Danny replied. "If you're lying about your background, how do we know you're competent to investigate anything?" The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. Sarah had used her military background as a tool for establishing authority, which was exactly the kind of behavior she had tried to avoid throughout her civilian career. Before she could respond, the confrontation took another dramatic turn. Rick, who had been watching the exchange with growing alarm, decided to intervene in the worst possible way. "You know what?" Rick said, his voice carrying frustration and poor judgment in equal measure. "If you really were some kind of elite soldier, maybe you should act like it. Stop arguing with the workers and just do your job." The comment was both insulting and inflammatory, implying that Sarah's military service should make her somehow immune to civilian workplace dynamics. It also demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of both military culture and professional investigation procedures. "My military training doesn't include dealing with workplace bullying," Sarah replied, her voice cold with controlled anger. "But it does include recognizing when someone is trying to obstruct an investigation." "Bullying?" Danny laughed harshly. "Lady, asking you to back up your wild claims isn't bullying, it's common sense." The situation might have continued escalating if not for an unexpected intervention from an unlikely source. Maria, who had been transferred to the Atlanta site 2 weeks earlier, arrived at the construction site just as the confrontation was reaching its peak. "What the hell is going on here?" Maria demanded, her voice carrying authority that surprised everyone present. "Martinez here claims she was a Navy SEAL," Danny explained, his tone suggesting the absurdity of the claim. "We're just asking for a little proof." Maria looked at Sarah with an expression that combined surprise, concern, and something approaching understanding. "Actually," Maria said quietly, "she's telling the truth." The declaration stunned everyone present into temporary silence. Danny stared at Maria with obvious confusion, while other workers began murmuring among themselves about this unexpected verification. "How would you know?" Danny asked suspiciously. "Because I looked her up after she saved my life in that trailer fire," Maria replied calmly. "Sarah Martinez was part of a classified Navy program that embedded female special operations personnel with SEAL teams for specific missions. The program was discontinued after budget cuts, but it was real." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at Maria's revelation. Having her military background by a credible source would end the immediate challenges to her.